A bill tying border security to aid for Ukraine and Israel is languishing in the Senate, and Republicans are calling it dead on arrival.
Frankly, it reads like a parody. It reads like a bill that's written almost to mock and troll people who believe our border should be secured.
I'm Sharon Stone, and coming up on Engage, we'll talk with Senator Marco Rubio about the immigration bill and the path to bipartisan cooperation. Representative Maxwell Frost joins us live to discuss the challenges facing a growing Central Florida market. And it's Mardi Gras season. A local shares anecdotes from celebrating across the Gulf Coast.
Mardi Gras is my favorite time of year, better than Christmas, better than 4th of July. We've been going to Mardi Gras since I was in a stroller. I have pictures of myself being pushed down Bourbon Street as a baby.
I'm Sharon Stone. Stay with us for WMFE's Engage. First, the news from NPR. Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. It's a guilty verdict for Jennifer Crumbley, the mother of a Michigan teenager who shot and killed 4 fellow students at Oxford High School in 2021. The jury found Crumbley guilty on 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter. It is the first time a parent has been tried for homicide in connection with a mass shooting carried out by their child. Her husband, James Crumbley, faces trial on identical charges. A federal appeals court is rejecting former President Donald Trump's immunity claims for actions taken while in office. The 3-judge panel said in its decision that for the purpose of this criminal case, former President Trump has become Citizen Trump with all of the defenses of any other criminal defendant. NPR's Carrie Johnson has more on today's unanimous ruling.
We got here because Trump's facing federal charges for his attempt to stay in office after he lost the election in 2020 to Joe Biden. Prosecutors say that culminated in violence at the Capitol 3 years ago. That violence injured 140 law enforcement officers and really shook the foundations of democracy.
NPR's Carrie Johnson reporting. Trump's lawyer has said he will appeal. After the ruling, the Trump campaign accused President Biden of weaponizing the government and called on donors to support the Republicans' campaign to return to the White House. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says Hamas has responded to a framework for a ceasefire with Israel that could mean the release of hostages.
Hamas responded tonight. We're reviewing that response now, and I'll be discussing it with the government of Israel tomorrow. There's still a lot of work to be done, but we continue to believe that an agreement is possible and indeed essential.
Blinken speaking from Qatar, the latest stop on his tour through the Middle East, his 5th since the Israel-Hamas war began in Gaza last October. In the U.S. House, the Republican leadership wants to move ahead with a vote on military aid to Israel this afternoon. NPR's Eric McDaniel says President Biden has threatened to veto the House bill, which lacks humanitarian aid and support for Ukraine and Taiwan.
It needs a 2/3 majority to pass the House because Republican opponents, upset about the bill's impact on the federal deficit, threw up a procedural hurdle. And while some Democrats have said that they would support the measure, others called it a trap, a stunt, and a ploy. In a letter, House Democratic leaders said the proposal was a, quote, attempt by MAGA extremists to undermine the possibility of a comprehensive bipartisan funding package that addresses America's national security challenges. If it fizzles, it would be the latest misstep for Speaker Mike Johnson, who has seen a number of his proposals fail on the floor in his short time as the top House Republican. Eric McDaniel, NPR News, the Capitol.
U.S. stocks are mixed this hour. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is up 59 points at 38,440. From Washington, this is NPR News. NASA was scheduled to launch its latest Earth-observing satellite last night, but as Joe Palca reports, bad weather at Cape Canaveral in Florida forced a 24-hour postponement.
The mission is called PACE, an acronym standing for Plankton Aerosol Cloud Ocean Ecosystem. Its primary goal is to measure the color of the ocean, a measurement that will tell scientists about the kinds of particles present in seawater. This, in turn, will help provide a better understanding of how global climate change is affecting oceans. The spacecraft also has instruments to measure air quality and cloud cover. A SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket will carry PACE into space. The launch is somewhat unusual. Instead of heading east from the Florida coast, the rocket will take off to the south, placing the probe into an orbit that will pass over the south and north poles. For NPR News, I'm Joe Palca.
Honda is recalling more than 750,000 vehicles in the United States for a defective sensor that may cause front passenger airbags to inflate prematurely. Many Honda and Acura models from 2020 to 2022 are affected. The U.S. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration said in documents posted today that the front passenger seat weight sensor may crack and short circuit and fail to disable the airbag as intended. The sensors are vital to turning off the airbags if children or small adults are in the seats and prone to injury. The Dow is up 66 points at 38,447. The Nasdaq is down 11. I'm Lakshmi Singh, NPR News in Washington.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Fisher Investments. As a fiduciary, Fisher Investments is obligated to act in their clients' best interest. Learn more at FisherInvestments.com. Investing in securities involves the risk of loss. This is NPR.
Welcome to Engage, leading conversations that matter. Engage explores Central Florida's issues and culture with new voices, new perspectives, and thought-provoking interviews. Engage is made possible with the support of members like you and inaugural sponsor, JustCallMo.com. Engage is hosted by Sharon Stone.
You are listening to Engage on 90.7 WMFE. I'm Sharon Stone. I want to welcome you and sincerely thank you for being here for our very first show. Let me tell you a little bit about the vision for Engage. Our goal is for Central Florida to engage with us and with new voices and perspectives to explore local issues and important news. We are committed to reflecting the diversity and the wide-ranging cultural experiences of our region. Yeah, we're going to talk about the challenges, but we will also save time at the end of each program to discover the opportunities and the optimism in our communities. In every show, we keep you, our audience, top of mind. Now, when we invite politicians to join us on this program, our goal is to focus on policy rather than politics. Just 2 people are elected to represent the state of Florida in the United States Senate. Yesterday, we spoke with one of them. We asked the state's senior senator, Marco Rubio, what Congress is doing on behalf of Central Florida. In our conversation, the Republican senator shared his own frustrations with gridlock and division. We started by asking the senator why his response to this border security and foreign aid bill was an easy no.
Well, I don't think you have enough time on this program to detail all of it, and I can go through it. But let's just start with the premise that the border today, the president has the authority needed to remedy what's caused this border crisis. This is what we're dealing with. It's not an immigration issue. This has to do with a runaway border crisis that began when he got rid of Remain in Mexico, got rid of safe third country requirements, stopped detention or detaining migrants that illegally entered the country. All these things were basically signals that if you came to America, you had an 85 to 90% chance of being able to enter the country and remain, probably permanently, though not legally, under his administration. And that he has the ability to reverse all those decisions. That said, if he puts all of those back in place and shows a willingness to enforce law, there are some things we can do to the law to improve it, to make it work even better, assuming the willingness is there to do it. But it really begins by him taking those steps. And remember, he spent 2.5 to 3 years saying there was no border crisis. And now he claims he wants to fix it. But then you go through the provisions of the bill, which I said, look, let's wait for this thing to come out. I don't want to opine on it on the basis of rumors and leaks. And frankly, it reads like a parody. It reads like a bill that's written almost to mock and troll people who believe our border should be secured. It gives just one example. It gives the Homeland Security Director, Mayorkas, today, the ability for the first time in the history of this country to adjudicate asylum cases bureaucratically at the border through agents that work for him to decide right off the bat whether people are entitled to that or not, and not allow them to be processed. As the sponsor of the bill, Senator Murphy of Connecticut himself detailed in text messages last night, it never actually shuts down the border. One example is they'll say, well, if the averages exceed 5,000 a day for 3 days or 8,500 in any single day, there are these provisions that will allow them to shut down that portion of the border. What they don't tell you is that number, that trigger number, does not include unaccompanied children, which is about a third of the people that cross the border on some days. So the number is actually not 5,000; it's significantly higher than that before you even hit that trigger. And by the way, that authority goes away in 3 years. All of these other things they create stay forever. So it's a long laundry list, and frankly, I'm rereading it again and making notes on it. But I've seen enough to tell you that this is not a border security bill. I don't care what they call it in the press release.
It's been referred to as a bipartisan bill that's resulted from months of negotiations. Do you believe that if Congress fails to act on this opportunity for reform, do both Republicans and Democrats share blame in the crisis?
No, because
Why?
at the end of the day, we have authorities right now to secure the border. If the president of the United States tomorrow announced, we are going to, if you went to a third country, let's say you came from Colombia and you stopped on the way in Honduras, you cannot then come to America. You are automatically not going to be accepted because you had a safe third country that you went to in the interim. You may be fleeing whatever it is you're fleeing, but that doesn't automatically allow you entry to the United States, especially if you were in another country outside of your own home country before you came here. If you reinstituted that, if he announced we are going to fully utilize the bed space we have available today, which is underutilized, to detain adults who cross the border. If he said those who apply for asylum that are in Mexico, maybe they're not even Mexican, but they're in Mexico, they have to apply from Mexico and await a decision. If you cross the border, you will not be allowed to apply for asylum. If you reinstituted those three policies alone, the border crossings would dramatically decline. The border crisis is being driven by perception. The people coming to this country do not know what the law is. They are operating on the reality that if they get across that border and turn themselves in, they have an 85 to 90% chance of being released into the country pending a future immigration hearing that most do not show up for. And they know this because they know people that have done it, perhaps in their own family. So the president has the authority now to end it because this all began the day he took over and repealed all these policies. And his refusal to do so and spending 2.5 years denying that we even had the border crisis puts it squarely on his shoulders and on his administration's shoulders. They wanted to reverse everything Trump did, and as a result, they created this crisis.
When we look at the solution, do you feel like as a senator, you can do anything to move the solution forward?
Well, at the end of the day, we pass laws, but laws have to be enforced. So if you think about what the law does, is it says, here's the law, and then it gives power to the executive agencies to enforce the laws. So you can make things illegal, but if the police officers won't arrest people and prosecutors won't prosecute them, as we've seen in cities after cities, then the law is largely ineffective. The law is only as good as your willingness to enforce it. In the case of immigration, there are those in this administration and in previous administrations who have made the decision to not enforce the law. For reasons they justify, we're not going to enforce the law. If you look at deferred action, which is DACA, it is basically an order not to enforce the law on people who came at a certain time and at a certain age. So they've done that well beyond just DACA. Obviously, they've done it in case after case. And basically what they're saying is if you enter the United States, even though you have no right to be here, we are going to release you into the country and we're going to give you a date in the future down the road to appear at an asylum hearing. Meantime, we'll give you a work permit and documents so you can travel the country and turn you over to a non-government organization, a charity that will help you, buy a plane ticket or a bus ride to the city of your choice. They basically decided not to enforce the immigration law. So we in Congress can pass laws, but you need to have a president willing to execute the law. And that's really the fundamental problem we're confronting right now.
Speaker Mike Johnson said he would take up this $17 billion bill for Israel aid. What are your thoughts on a separate funding measure for either Israel or Ukraine?
If we put up Israel's vote today for funding, it would pass, I wouldn't say unanimous, but it would pass overwhelmingly in the House and Senate. The reason why we are not going to be able to do that is because Schumer, the Democratic leader, will not allow it. And the reason why he won't allow it is because he knows that Israel is popular. So he wants it linked to all these other things that may not enjoy the same level of support. Another piece of it is Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific funding, particularly for Taiwan. I support it. On Ukraine, as long as there's a plan and a strategy in place, which I think some of the appropriation language that the people worked on for this bill requires, I'm in favor of some level of help to Ukraine. I don't think we can just get up and run away from it. And I think if you put each of these up for a vote by themselves, they would pass by different margins, but they would pass. But they've linked them all together. in order to say, well, if you want Israel, you have to vote for all these other things. And the reverse is true. They're saying to Americans who want border security, if you want border security, you have to give money for Ukraine. You have to give money for all these foreign priorities, which are not unimportant priorities, but they link these things on purpose. So if there's a bill before me that funds Israel, I'm for it. It funds Israel's efforts, I'm for it. You know, I by the way, the reason why Israel's still getting money and is not urgent yet is because of a bill I passed that authorized funding for Israel for the next 10 years. So that's already been built in. But obviously, they're going to need more, or at least replenish future years that they're drawing down on now. But each of these bills would pass on their own, but they want to tie them all together because they know that Israel one is very popular, and they think they can use that to force people to vote for things they don't support.
Senator, a goal of mine with this platform is to amplify underheard voices here. Who do you think is underheard and why?
I think the most underheard people in America today, and this has probably been true now for more than 25 years, are normal, everyday, working American families. You know, people that get up in the morning, they don't necessarily follow politics on social media hour by hour. They work hard. Prices have gone up for them. Then they go home and they turn on the TV and they see our borders being overrun. They're not necessarily isolationists, but I do think they have questions about, with all the problems we have in our country, why do we spend so much in these other places? Their kids did everything they were told. They went to school, they got good grades, they went to college, they got a degree, and now those kids with that degree cannot find a job, but they owe a bunch of money. People that are frustrated that things that used to be widely accepted are now considered abnormal or wrong, or you can't talk about it anymore. That's the most over. I think there has never in the modern history of our country been a bigger disconnect between the people that run things and the people in charge of things and people in power and everyday people in this country. And that phenomena is what leads to what is called in the vernacular, what people like to call populism. But ultimately, that's what happens when people feel that no matter who they vote for or who they put in charge, what they care about, their priorities, are not the priorities of those who are in power. And I think, to me, that those real life, everyday issues that consume people, the cost of living, the concerns about their children's future, their safety and security, the fact that the world seems to be catching fire everywhere, these are the things that are tormenting people, and that doesn't seem to get enough attention in either the media or in politics, frankly.
Other than voting, what should those people do to be heard in Washington?
Well, I think that's really the most important thing, is the voting piece of it. But that alone is not enough. I think part of it is also accountability, and that is holding those who you elect accountable to staying true to that. Look, it's a tough thing. There are a lot of things that our government has to do and be involved in that aren't necessarily daily priorities, but they matter, and so those things are important to take care of. So, and I think and there's a part of leadership that also requires informing people of things and explaining to them why certain things matter. And, for example, why the U.S. just got up and walked away from Ukraine, how it could actually hurt us and our alliance system, which is critical to our country's security. But I think people are more receptive to that if they feel like those who are in charge have not completely ignored and never talk about the things they talk about. And so I think that level of accountability in both, how people opine on politics on a daily basis and ultimately how they vote is really important. I also think it explains why today candidates that have never held office or do not come from previous government service have become increasingly, untraditional candidates have become increasingly appealing to people who feel like, oh, we've already tried the traditional way and it hasn't worked. Let's send some people up there that will shake things up. There are some negatives attached to that too. If it becomes, entertainment and showmanship, you have to actually show action and get things done. But I think it explains a lot of that phenomenon. And it's not just here in America; it's happening in countries around the world.
Thinking about that normal, everyday person, they're hearing money for Ukraine is uncertain. The border bill, it's not happening. We get these short-term funding extensions that keep the government open little by little. So what do you say to that average person, this average listener here in Central Florida, who sees this gridlock and wonders, what is Congress doing?
Well, I think that's a great question. It's one I ask myself every day, and I get on an airplane every week and fly up there, and we spend another week, for example, in the Senate, voting on nominees, but not on public policy that would make a difference. I think there's a lot of gamesmanship that's going on. It's not, again, this is a perfect example. If this is a normal process run by people, in everyday life, they would say, okay, what do we agree on? We all agree on Israel. Okay, let's get that one done. All right, we don't entirely agree on Ukraine. Can we come up with a level of funding that we agree on, and then we get that done. And then on the border, they would say, well, how can anybody be for what's happening now? How can anybody be for the fact that every single day, 7,000 to 10,000 people just walk into America? Like we saw in New York the other day, some of them commit crimes and they're let go into the street. How can that be happening? How can that not be a priority for everybody? But that's not how politics is played today. The way it's played today is you go up there and you say, okay, everybody's in favor of Israel, but we're not going to vote on that. We're not going to vote on that until we agree on everything else. And then there's, there are groups out there that don't 100% agree, right? They may not be majorities, but they're powerful interest groups that don't want anything done about the border. In fact, they don't think this is a crisis. They think the only crisis is we're not letting people in fast enough. So those elements play out as well. And even though they don't represent the majority, they represent a significant percentage of one of the party's voting bases. So, and that's really what impedes them. There's always been elements of that. But I think now, unfortunately, what's happened is the differences are so dramatic between both sides that it makes it really difficult to find agreement unless we're hitting some sort of a deadline or we're facing some sort of unavoidable catastrophe. And we've put off a lot of really important decisions. And I know it's frustrating to people at home. I can tell you it's really frustrating to someone who went into this process with the hopes of making a difference and getting things done. And every year it's gotten harder to do that.
If you and I had the opportunity to follow up in 6 months, do you have any optimism? Do you feel like there would be progress for us to talk about?
Well, I believe ultimately we'll fund government. So I don't know if that's progress, but I think it's important not to have these shutdowns, which I think are very, very disruptive and damaging. But as far as legislation is concerned, you get into an election year, it's going to become harder and harder to pass meaningful pieces of legislation. Now, look, there are things that pass. The National Defense Authorization Act passed. Those things pass, and they're not exciting. They're not. They don't draw a lot of clicks and ratings, but they're important. There are things embedded in those laws that actually make a difference, and we would know it made a difference if we didn't do them. But so I think will continue to be things like that get done. I think there might be a chance to make some progress on tax reform, like the expanded child tax credit, assuming it continues to be linked to work and not turn into just a government transfer payment, but which is something I've long supported. But as far as major achievements, I think the differences are so vast, and our system is set up to be incremental to begin with. I don't think 6 months from now, frankly, there's enough time to get anything transformational done. That doesn't mean we can't get important things done, but it would require us making that a priority in both the House and Senate. And right now, the Senate largely spends its time voting on nominees.
More ahead with Senator Marco Rubio, and later here on Engage, we will talk with Representative Maxwell Frost. I'm Sharon Stone. There's more to come. You are listening to Engage on 90.7 WMFE. I'm Sharon Stone. Ahead on the program, we will talk with an Orlando native about growing up as a Mardi Gras regular.
I just love playing football on the road between the parades, listening to the marching bands, catching the beads.
The owner of Tibby's New Orleans Kitchen talks about Mardi Gras in the Big Easy. But first, we continue our conversation with Senator Marco Rubio. We picked up our discussion by addressing a bill in the Florida State House that would restrict the use of social media by minors under 16. And just last week, CEOs from the top sites, including Facebook and TikTok, gathered at Capitol Hill to be grilled by a Senate panel. And we asked Senator Rubio how he felt about the proposed restrictions in Florida and his reaction to that Senate hearing.
My only concern about it would be, first, social media is not a state phenomenon. It's an interstate commerce issue, right? I mean, it involves things across state lines. And so it's very difficult for states to regulate that. My sense is some court would probably strike it down on those grounds. I do think, and I haven't thought through it, and I can't imagine, I think it's important to be honest with people. Like, I don't think this is an easy solution. I do think there should be some higher levels of control as to what children of a certain age can get permission to do on these social media platforms. I think parents should be empowered with more opportunities. But I also don't want to, but by the same token, I don't want to I don't want to leave the impression that this is going to be an easy thing to do in terms of passing a state law, and all of a sudden, every one of these social media platforms is going to ban people that are under 16 years of age. When you talk about things that you're conducting online, it's hard sometimes to even know the age of those people.
Sure.
There's loopholes around it. I can assure you that, as a parent, I can tell you this generation is very good at finding ways to work around technological. So, but I do think the topic is a valid one, and that is there are some positives that come with social media. We get news and information and awareness and connection faster than we ever have. There are businesses that rely heavily on social media as well for marketing. But like anything and like any innovation, there are negatives. And one of those negatives is that this young generation of Americans is being bombarded with information flow set by analytics that often are things that are not positive and healthy, whether it's behavior or in some cases harmful psychologically as well. So I do think that's an issue that we're going to need to confront as a country, and that is not. I don't know if some bill in one state can solve it, but I'm not an expert on the Florida law. I have not read it. I've read stories about it, but I don't know all the details of it. But I think the broader topic is a very legitimate one.
Yeah, and are there any takeaways that you could share just from the hearings from the CEO, Zuckerberg, about what happened there?
Well, I understand that these companies, when they were first started, like when Facebook first came out, everybody said, well, how are they going to make money? And the answer is they make money by advertising. And the value of advertising on them is they know who's watching, and they can promise you not just an audience, but an audience that's captive, that likes their analytics, their algorithm tells them who the people are that are likeliest to respond to a message or likeliest to respond to a product. Okay, that's what makes them valuable. But what that means then is that the flip side of it is they have to show you things that are interesting that people want to see. And oftentimes what people like to see is scandalous and outrageous and maybe damaging and so forth. And I think seen by the mind, by a 40-year-old mind, a 50-year-old mind, a 35-year-old mind is very different than when someone who's 13, 14, 15, or 16 is exposed to it. And so I think that really is the dynamic that those companies are struggling with. And that is that what makes them valuable, what allows them to make money is their ability to show people online what those people will be interested in and want to see and what's going to get clicks and generate attention. And oftentimes it generates clicks and attention may not be true, or maybe harmful, maybe encouraging harmful, and I think that's the reality these companies face. Is they do not want to go too far in policing this stuff because ultimately it hurts what makes them valuable, allows them to monetize their product. And I think that was abundant the other day, and that is that they can apologize after the fact and they can do things on the front end to high publicity, but at the end of the day, they make money because they are very good at their algorithm is very good at identifying what is going to generate attention, and what is going to generate attention is not always good for young minds, and they're not going to go overboard in regulating that unless forced to, because it hurts their bottom line.
Just based on the number of bills passed in the last year in Congress, it's on track to be one of the least productive in decades. So what has to be done so one party isn't blaming the other and there's actually progress?
Well, first, let me say our system was designed to not pass a lot of laws. Frankly, when our system was designed, they never envisioned having a federal government that did as much as it does. It reserved most of the powers to the states, which are closer to people. And I think generally that's still probably wise. I mean, there's things like foreign policy and things of that nature that are federal in nature, most certainly. But that's the reality of it. I think that's always true when you think about how hard it is to get things passed through Congress. And then you add into the dynamic of the House that was largely not open for business for some period of time this year. And then you add into that dynamic a Senate that, even though the Democrats are majority, they don't have 60 votes, so they'd have to get past filibusters. And then you add to that just the almost sectarian type divide in our politics, where both sides are far away from each other on the basis of what they believe our country should be doing. And I think it explains a lot of it. Now, there are bills that will pass. It has been, these last 2 years have felt a little less productive, most certainly, because most of the things that the House can pass can't pass in the Senate. And most of the things the Senate can pass, the House can't pass for a lot of, and I think that's a dynamic that we're facing that's real. So, it's frustrating. I know it's frustrating for people when you look at major issues and see them unresolved. It's really frustrating for someone who is in this process in the hopes of being able to make a difference. and you get up there every week and you're basically voting on nominees, which are not unimportant, but you see very little work done on bringing things to the floor that have to do with meaningful legislation. And there are a bunch of things that may not be dramatic, may not be high profile, but that we could pass. And the majority leader has decided not to schedule those things for floor votes. That is frustrating to me. And I don't understand what his strategy is behind it, but he's decided not to do that.
Senator Rubio is in his third term representing Florida in the United States Senate. Coming up, we will hear from Congressman Maxwell Frost here on Engage. You may know Maxwell Frost as the first member of Generation Z to be elected to the United States Congress. The Democratic congressman represents the Orlando area in the U.S. House of Representatives. He joins us now live. So, Congressman, thank you so much and welcome to Engage.
Of course. Thanks for having me on.
Before you joined us here on Engage, our listeners were hearing from Senator Marco Rubio about his opposition to the Senate border security bill that also includes support for Ukraine and Israel. Now, that's already been deemed dead on arrival by House Speaker Mike Johnson. He said your chamber will take up a separate funding bill for Israel. So I'd like to start there. What are your thoughts on this border bill?
Well, on the border bill in the Senate, first off, I want to applaud Chris Murphy, Senator Murphy. He was given an impossible task to be able to negotiate with folks who are not coming to us in good faith here. I appreciate the effort. I really love Senator Chris Murphy, but there's a few things that's wrong here. Number one, the process. There were no Latinos, no congressional Hispanic members included in these negotiations that are going to drastically impact our communities. The way this is done is important. Number two is the product, and the product is deeply flawed, has really zero of what Democrats have been fighting for in terms of speedy path to citizenship for the undocumented folks who see in this country, especially those who've been here for over a decade. And it's really a bill that sells out immigrants in exchange for permanent negative immigration policies and laws. And it's something that I think I can't support personally, but it looks like it probably won't even make its way over here.
Would you consider a separate measure for supporting Israel or Ukraine?
I'd have to see the bill. I mean, we're going to have one that we vote on here today. I think the aid for Ukraine is incredibly important. I am for, defense aid to Israel that's used in accordance with international law and in support of a two-state solution. I think the bill that we have in front of us here in the House is not that. And so I'll be voting against that later today. My hope is that, Republicans can put politics aside and we can actually talk about the needs here. I mean, you talk about Ukraine. Ukraine needs funds now. If they're going to keep this up. It is the most desperate foreign aid that we need to get out in terms of military aid is Ukraine, and Republicans don't want that. If this bill passes later today, any path towards getting aid to Ukraine is gone, which is a gift to Putin.
Congressman, how do you just feel about the handling of this? I'm talking to a senator about one thing, congressman on the other side, and everyone's trying to get to some agreement. How do you feel about how this is being handled?
I don't think it's being handled in the right way. I mean, just look, Speaker Johnson has had multiple opportunities to put up a bill for aid to Israel, if he actually cares about it, and actually couple in Ukraine. But because the most vocal conservative, right-wing, neo-fascist voices in his party forbid anything to go to Ukraine, they might be rooting for Putin, I guess. It just hasn't come to fruition. The other thing you got to look at is there is absolutely zero aid for Gaza in the bill we're voting on later today. That's a red line for me. I mean, we're talking about a situation where over 27,000 people have been bombed, have been killed. UNICEF says it's the worst place on earth to be a child. And so you're going to just completely strip all the aid out of the package. I mean, it's disgraceful and it's disgusting. And so I can't support it. And we're looking towards the future here, but honestly, it's hard to paint a good picture when we have a essentially Christian nationalist Speaker of the House who caves and is part of the very extreme MAGA right wing of the party. So it's hard to predict where we're going to go from here.
While I have you, I want to talk to you about some other legislation. Actually, you recently announced more than $180 million in Infrastructure for Rebuilding America grant money. That's actually for truck parking spaces along I-4. And I'm pretty sure that if not almost all, every single one of our viewers or our listeners, they have dealt with some kind of issue on I-4. So help me understand what you're expecting the impact of this grant awarded by the Department of Transportation to be.
Yeah, and these grants are extremely important. They're not the most exciting to talk about on the news, right? They're not the most sexy grants and parking spaces, but people have to pay attention on why this is important. You've been driving down I-4. Everyone listening has driven on I-4 and have seen trucks just on the sides of the roads. Oftentimes they're on the side of the with a very small space right next to the lanes, which creates a safety hazard for folks on I-4. We know I-4 is one of the deadliest highways in the entire country. So this is going to allow us to create 917 truck parking spaces along 4 different sites for I-4 in Central Florida. It's going to help us with the negative impact we've seen on truck driver safety, and it's going to help with our supply chain ability to deliver to Floridians too. So all in all, it's good for everybody, and we're happy that we were able to work with Congressman Darren Soto to deliver the $180 million from the infrastructure bill.
Okay, so you think that having those parking spots will create a place to rest and therefore make it safer for all of us?
Exactly. Very important. Very important. I'm not always one to be spending a ton of money on parking spaces, but this is an important one.
Let's talk a bit about jobs in the economy. Wall Street has been setting record highs recently. The January jobs report exceeded expectations. Inflation is slowing. So if all these signs are so good, why don't more voters feel good about the economy?
Yeah, I mean, and I just to harp on that point again, I mean, we've seen that the president's economic policies are helping us have a soft landing here on the inflation that we saw and a lot of the problems that we saw because of COVID and the disastrous policies of former President Donald Trump. And so that's a good thing. It shows that, and you look in history when Democrats are in charge, the economy does better. And so big props to the president on that. As far as the polling is concerned, yeah, and this is an issue for almost every president in terms of the economy. It's difficult. And we're coming out of a very difficult time when we talk about what happened during COVID to jobs, to people's ability to keep themselves afloat. And now we're getting to a place where we're getting in a better area. But there's a lot more work to do. I mean, people still have to have multiple jobs to get ahead. We still have corporations that are price gouging, taking advantage of certain situations. I mean, just look at gas prices have gone down, but when they were up, the CEOs in these companies were making high profits. And so there's a lot more work that needs to be done on this. And that's part of the reason that we need to reelect the president so we can finish the job here and get the economy to a better place.
Congressman, do you agree with criticism that Democrats need to do a better job with that messaging?
I do. I mean, and this has been something that Democrats have had trouble with messaging for a long time. It's part of the reason I decided to run in the first place. Oftentimes Democrats, we like to talk from a place of, privilege or talking about the economy in ways that it's difficult for folks to understand. At the end of the day, we could talk about the Dow Jones, we could talk about the stock market. People want to talk about their pocketbook, and we still have the majority of Americans who live paycheck to paycheck. So there's still a lot of work we need to do. That doesn't cancel out the fact that we have had a soft landing here on inflation, but it just means we need to talk to the anxieties that people are facing now, and people don't want to feel like they're being talked at. You can talk about the great things you've done while also saying we have a long way to go and we still have work to do. And that's why we're running again. That's why I'm running again for re-election in my districts, why the president's running for re-election. So there's better work we need to do on messaging here, but I believe we'll get to the right place.
I want to talk a bit more about issues that have been important to you. One of them is, I think a lot of people can relate to, out-of-pocket cost, limiting it to $60 for these EpiPens. And you are someone who just understands the importance of this. You've actually been in a situation suffering a life-threatening allergic reaction. Talk to me about where you are with that bill, please, and the purpose.
Yeah, so we're really excited about the EpiPen Act, which will, and anyone listening who is paid for an EpiPen or has a child with allergies knows EpiPens are very expensive. They can go up to $600. And I believe, and especially as someone who I almost died because of allergy attack, and I had to use an expired EpiPen because using an expired EpiPen, using EpiPens that are very old, it's a very normal thing in the allergy community because the EpiPens are so expensive. And so my bill will cap EpiPens at $30 per EpiPen, $60 for a pack of 2 for people who have private insurance. And it's going to be a game changer, especially for families and young people who need to have EpiPens in multiple places. You want to have one at the nurse's office at school. You want to have one in the car. You want to have one at home. You want to have one at the grandparents' house. And it's just not a fiscally viable thing for a lot of working families to do because they're so expensive. So this is something that I'm hoping will get bipartisan support. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat, Republican, Independent, Green Party, anything. If you have anaphylaxis and you don't have an EpiPen, you can die. And we want to make sure that we get this important auto injector into the hands of families that need it, and cost should not be a barrier.
Any clue of some kind of timeline on that?
Not 100% sure just yet. I mean, look, because Republicans here in the House are controlling things, and Speaker Johnson and Speaker McCarthy before him have had the House in chaos, this is the most unproductive House of Representatives since the Great Depression. So there's not a lot of bills being passed in general. And so our hope is that we'll be able to speed it up, but it's difficult to say. But I'll say because of the Republican dysfunction, this might have to be a thing that we really address when Democrats take back the House next year. But we're still going to push for it no matter what. We're going to push to get sponsors on it. But I'll tell you, things up here, things aren't going in a good way, and Congress isn't working the way it should for our people.
I want to talk more about that. But before we transition to that, are there any other bills or things that you're working on that you think our listeners in Central Florida would like to know about that you and I haven't talked about yet?
Well, I'd have to talk about every single piece of legislation I've introduced because they all are so directly connected to people in Central Florida. I can talk to you about something that we've been able to move forward. Daniel Webster and I, Daniel Webster is a Republican who borders my district. We've introduced the Hurricane Preparedness Act, which will better equip NOAA to ensure that whether you speak a different language or you're a senior or you're folks with someone with a disability, we want to study and understand what influences people to actually heed evacuation orders and a lot of the critical information that comes from NOAA and news outlets during hurricane season. I'm not sure if folks are aware of this, but most of the people who die during a hurricane are seniors and people with disabilities. We think that's a travesty, and we want to make sure that we fix that. And so that actually moved forward in committee as a part of the Weather Act. We're confident that that'll pass the House floor and hopefully be signed by the president. That also leads to another one of my bills, which is the Safe Through Medicare Act. Because everyone who died during Hurricane Ian was a senior 65 plus, we looked into it. A lot of those people died because their dialysis machines or their machines that cool their insulin or et cetera stopped working when the power ran out. And so we saw an opportunity here where we believe Medicare should cover 100% of the cost of external cooling systems and electric generators to make sure that our seniors can stay safe, and that whether it's dialysis, a BiPAP machine, keeping insulin cool, that when the power goes out in Florida, which we know is a fact of life of being a Floridian, that every senior can be safe. So those are just two examples of things. Actually, the last one I'll bring up are one of our biggest legislative wins so far. The first bill I introduced as a member of Congress was to create a federal office of gun violence prevention. For people who might not know, it's difficult for a freshman member of Congress in the minority to start a federal agency or department. But we introduced it nonetheless, got over 80 co-sponsors very quickly. We might be at about 100 now. And we pushed and worked with the administration. And look, we know that there's a lot of dysfunction in the House, but we lose 100 people a day due to gun violence. So we didn't want to let that get in the way of this important work. So we worked with the administration, and the president actually took my bill and implemented it via executive order. And now we have a federal office of gun violence prevention. And just about a week later, because of that office and the work that my office has been doing, the city of Orlando got $1.5 million for community violence intervention, a program that we've seen help bring gun violence rates down in the city of Orlando. So there's some great work going on despite the dysfunction, and imagine what more we'll be able to do when Democrats take back the majority.
I want to go back to something you said a couple minutes ago about there's not a lot of bills being passed in Congress. What do you say to people who see that and see that Congress is on track to be one of the least productive Congresses in decades in terms of getting the number of bills passed? And they wonder, what are you all doing on Capitol Hill?
It's really unfortunate. And, this is why the people who hold the gavels, and when I say that, I mean the people who are in charge up here, the majority party really does run the show in terms of what legislation gets on the floor, how committees are run, how we respond to crisis and what's going on in our country. And what seen over the past year is that Republicans have been unable to lead an effective House. Because here's the thing I want everybody at home to know. The debates we're having up here at this point, usually it's about ideology. I disagree with you on this issue, and we tussle it out, and sometimes we compromise, and sometimes we're victorious, and et cetera. But I'll tell you, most of the problems we've seen up here don't even have to do with the fact that I disagree with a piece of legislation. That's a big part of it. The problem is we're barely getting legislation to disagree on because the function of Congress isn't working, because we have a Republican Party that has a growing and very vocal far-right extreme MAGA wing of the party. And we've had both Kevin McCarthy and now Speaker Johnson who capitulate and kind of do whatever people like Marjorie Taylor Greene want them to do. And so when you have a situation like that, it puts moderates in a weird position. It puts everybody in a weird position. And this is what we've seen. I mean, everyone should know the House of Representatives did not work at all for about 2 months because Republicans couldn't get their act together and elect a Speaker of the House, which is something that's should be very easy for a party to do. And so the solution here is just changing out who's in the majority and having Democrats do it. And to be clear, it's not just this past year. Look at the last 2 times before this that Republicans were running the House. We had Speaker Boehner who had to resign. Why did he have to resign? Because there was a threat of a motion to vacate, and he actually said, you know what, I don't want to go down this road. He left. The same thing happened with the person after him. And so this has been a situation that's been bubbling up for roughly a decade. And now we finally just had a Speaker McCarthy who I guess called the bluff, and they actually kicked him out. And so we've seen this happening for over a decade. They're just not ready to lead up here yet. And so it's important that we get the gavel into the hands of people who are ready to actually get bills on the floor and pass legislation.
You and I have been talking about inflation, healthcare affordability, gun violence, and I was actually reading some Pew research, and right up there, according to what is on people's minds, the public's concerns, right up there with those issues, people name the ability of Republicans and Democrats to work together as one of their biggest concerns, and there wasn't a partisan divide on that. What do you say to the people raising these concerns about the parties working together?
I mean, this is why we're sent up here. We are sent up here to work with what we got and the people we have across the side of the aisle. And I'll tell you, oftentimes people see it as a binary choice. Either you're going to stay true to your values, fight for what you can believe in, or you're going to always compromise on every single thing. And we need legislators who know how to prioritize certain things and do both. We do need bold fighters up here right now, because I'll tell you that if you're someone who wants to protect abortion rights, Republicans, because of their efforts, have overturned Roe versus Wade. And now in the state of Florida, I mean, we're supposed to have a decision tomorrow, I think, or on Thursday from the Florida Supreme Court on this. And a month later, abortion could be pretty much completely banned in the state of Florida. We need people to fight against it, because you're either for abortion rights or you're not. So there's situations like that. But we also need to figure out ways to work together in the meanwhile to help the American people in the ways that we can. That's why I'm proud that half of my bills are bipartisan. We've seen 2 of them move forward in the House. And so there's a lot of work to do. We need folks who know how to do both. And I think my office has done a good job of being a bold fighter when we need it, and also making sure that we reach across the aisle when we need it too. I have 2 bills with Representative Corey Mills, who, look, Corey and I disagree on a lot of different things, but we agreed on ensuring that active duty overseas folks in the military have the codified right to vote.
Congressman, we have about 10 seconds left. I don't want you to get cut off.
Yeah, of course. And we agree that we need to rein in and make sure we're not frivolously spending money on the military budget. And so there's a lot of work to do, but glad to be here to be doing on behalf of the folks in the 10th Congressional District.
And we appreciate you being here with us. Maxwell Frost is Orange County's Congressional U.S. Representative. Every year, hundreds of thousands of revelers descend on New Orleans to attend a gathering that rivals any New Year's celebration, spring break, or Super Bowl party. Mardi Gras has become ubiquitous with beads, beignets, and binge drinking in the Big Easy. But the history behind the holiday has religious roots that stretch back to Europe in the Middle Ages. Originating from Catholic celebrations preceding Lent, the traditions were brought to the colonies in the late 17th century. The first recorded Mardi Gras party took place in 1703 at Fort Louis de la Mobile in Alabama. Here in Florida, the first Mardi Gras celebrations were held in Pensacola in the early 1800s. Today, it's become a cause for celebration from the Panhandle to the Keys. In Orlando, Universal Studios throws a parade and party that amps up visitor volume, but they do not have a monopoly on Central Florida Mardi Gras. Tibby's New Orleans Kitchen in Winter Park features an authentic New Orleans menu cultivated by 4 generations of the Wheeler family. Today, Jake Wheeler runs the operation with 3 locations.
Mardi Gras is my favorite time of year, better than Christmas, better than 4th of July. We've been going to Mardi Gras since I was in a stroller. I have pictures of myself being pushed down Bourbon Street as a baby.
Wheeler's a first-generation Orlandoan, but his parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so forth are native New Orleanians. For Wheeler, Mardi Gras is about family.
We used to go on these family vacations where all 20 of us, all the cousins, would drive through Mobile. We'd stop there, catch some parades, and drive to New Orleans and stay at my aunt's. She had a fish camp on the bayou, and we'd stay there for about a week and have a blast.
The interior of Tibby's, it's nuts. The dining room looks like a Mardi Gras bomb exploded all over the walls.
We have authentic Mardi Gras float props that we bought from Blaine Kern Studios in New Orleans. They're in the main dining room. There's 3 of them. One's a pirate head, one's a massive Medusa head, and then the third one's a very large sun. They were used on parade floats and put in storage, and we bought them out of storage and we hung them up on the walls.
He shared stories about acquiring the decor amidst the menagerie of Mardi Gras memorabilia.
There's this trophy behind us. It's from the early 70s. My grandfather worked with Blaine Kern Studios, and they designed the first animated Mardi Gras float, and they won an award for Best Animated Prop on the parade float. So that's what that trophy is. Now what they did was they took a semi-truck trailer, and they put a jester's head on it, and they put one of the sons of one of the people riding on the parade float was in the head on a bicycle, pedaling it, and it made the eyes blink, the mouth open, and they created this animated prop. Now my dad, he was probably in elementary school at the time. He was riding on the float, and he said when they got to the bridge on the parade route, they didn't measure it properly, so they had to cut the head down and finish the parade headless.
Wheeler explained for New Orleans expats, Mardi Gras provided a reason to come back to the bayou and visit family.
When I was in elementary school, from kindergarten through 5th, maybe 6th grade, every year we would take a huge group of friends to Mardi Gras in New Orleans. So the night before we'd leave, we'd have a party at our house. My parents would host it. Then the next morning you'd wake up, either drive there or fly there. Then everyone would stay at the same hotel. And then for 5 nights, me and my friends, we'd all watch these parades. And I was young, so it was a blast. And then they'd bring a babysitter with us on the trip. So at night, we'd go back with the babysitter, and the parents would go out. But I just loved playing football on the road between the parades, listening to the marching bands, catching the beads. We'd see my cousins from Louisiana, too. There was Larry. I don't know what happened to Larry now, but we'd hang out with him there when we were growing up.
Officially, this year's Mardi Gras started on Saturday and concludes tomorrow. But the celebrations across the state and at Tibby's will continue for weeks. That's all for today's edition of Engage. Join us Thursday. We'll be joined by Orlando Mayor Buddy Dyer.
Engage is a production of 90.7 WMFE. Our host is Sharon Stone, and the senior producer is Richard Copeland. Engage is available on the radio at 90.7 FM in Orlando and 89.5 FM in Ocala and the Villages, as well as on podcast platforms, smart speakers, and the WMFE website. Engage is made possible through the support of members like you and inaugural sponsor JustCallMo.com.